I first met David in college, during a group project neither of us cared about. He was charming in an effortless way, broad-shouldered, quick to laugh, and always slightly unkempt, as though he had better things to do than fuss over appearances. We became fast friends, the kind of bond where time felt irrelevant. Over the years, I watched him rise and stumble, his life a whirlwind of successes and heartbreaks. Now, years later, we found ourselves sitting in my living room, the air thick with the weight of his latest heartbreak. David's breakup with his girlfriend, Emily, had been messy. They'd been together for 4 years, a time marked by vacations, inside jokes, and a shared apartment filled with memories. But all of it unraveled when he discovered her infidelity. He hadn't given me the specifics. David rarely shared more than he absolutely needed, but the pain in his eyes spoke volumes. "I don't even know who I am without her," he muttered, staring into the amber liquid swirling in his glass. "David, you're more than this relationship," I said softly, unsure if my words held any weight. "You'll get through this?" He let out a bitter laugh. "You make it sound so simple, Mike. Like I can just snap my fingers and stop feeling like everything I built is gone." I wanted to argue, to tell him that he was worth so much more than the wreckage Emily left behind. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and let the silence settle between us, hoping it would offer a comfort my words couldn't. Our friendship had always been defined by moments like this, unspoken understanding, quiet support. But as I sat there watching David wrestle with his pain, I felt an ache that went beyond friendship. I'd spent years burying the truth, convincing myself that my feelings for him were nothing more than misplaced admiration. Now, with Emily gone and David's world shattered, those feelings clawed their way to the surface. Over the next few weeks, I became David's anchor. He started crashing on my couch more often, too weary to return to the apartment he and Emily had shared. Late-night conversations became our routine, his voice tinged with exhaustion as he unpacked memories of their relationship. "She wasn't always like this," he said one night, his head tilted back against the sofa. "When we first met, she was everything. Fun, spontaneous, kind. I don't know when it all started to fall apart. Maybe it wasn't just her," I offered carefully. "Relationships change, people change. It doesn't mean you weren't enough." He turned to me then, his eyes red but focused. "You always know what to say, Mike. I don't know what I'd do without you." His words warmed and broke me all at once. I wanted to be there for him, to be the person he could rely on. But I also wanted more, something I knew I couldn't have. As the days turned into weeks, our closeness grew in ways that felt both natural and dangerous. He started leaning on me for more than just emotional support. I cooked for him, helped him sort through the clutter Emily had left behind, and even stayed up late watching the movies that once reminded him of her but now seemed to bring him some solace. It was during one of those quiet nights that I noticed the shift. We were sitting on the floor, the coffee table between us covered in takeout containers and empty beer bottles. The glow of the TV cast soft shadows across his face, and for a moment, he didn't seem broken anymore. He laughed at something I said, a genuine, full-bodied laugh that made my chest tighten. "You're the only person who can make me laugh right now," he said, his voice soft. I shrugged, trying to play it off. "That's what friends are for." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the briefest moment, I wondered if he could see the truth I'd worked so hard to hide. But the moment passed, and he turned back to the screen, leaving me to wrestle with my thoughts. Despite his progress, the scars of his breakup lingered. David's mood swung unpredictably. One day he'd be cracking jokes, and the next he'd be drowning in self-doubt. He blamed himself for Emily's betrayal, convinced that his shortcomings had pushed her away. "It's not your fault," I told him one evening, my voice firmer than usual. "She made her choices. That's on her, not you." He shook his head. "You don't get it, Mike. I wasn't enough. I wasn't, I don't know, exciting enough, successful enough. She wanted more, and I couldn't give it to her." "David, stop," I said, my frustration spilling over. "You're one of the best people I know. If she couldn't see that, then that's her loss. He stared at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I'd pushed too far, but then his shoulders sagged, and he let out a shaky breath. "Thanks," he said quietly. Our conversation ended there, but the weight of his words stayed with me. By the end of the month, David started talking about moving forward, getting back to the gym, meeting new people, finding himself again. I was proud of him, even as a selfish part of me dreaded the thought of him pulling away. One night, as we sat on the balcony overlooking the city, he turned to me with a faint smile. "You've been my rock through all of this, Mike," he said. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't have to," I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "That's what friends are for." But as the words left my mouth, I realized they felt like a lie. I didn't just want to be his friend. I wanted to be the person he turned to not out of necessity, but out of choice. For now, though, I settled for what I could have: quiet nights, shared laughter, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd see me in a different light someday. And as I watched him stare out at the skyline, his face softened by the glow of the city lights, I couldn't help but wonder if that moment was closer than I thought. David showed up at my door late that evening, his jacket clutched in one hand, rain dripping from the edges of his hair. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot and his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "I couldn't stay there tonight," he said quietly, stepping inside without waiting for my reply. "It's just too much." I nodded, taking his jacket and leading him to the couch. He didn't need to explain. Ever since the breakup, his apartment had become a minefield of memories, each corner haunted by remnants of Emily's presence. "I'll make us some tea," I offered, giving him space to settle in. When I returned, he was staring out the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. He took the cup with a small nod of thanks but didn't speak for a while. I let the silence stretch, knowing he would talk when he was ready. "Do you ever feel like you're not enough?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd come to recognize. "Like no matter what you do, it's never enough for the people you care about. Like you're destined to disappoint them." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he was more than enough, but I knew he wasn't looking for empty reassurances. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I think it's less about not being enough and more about expecting too much of ourselves. You're human, David. You're allowed to stumble." He looked at me then, his gaze heavy with something I couldn't quite name. "You always know what to say, Mike." "I don't know how you do it." I shrugged, forcing a small smile. "I just care about you. That's all." The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd said too much. But then he smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made my chest ache. That night, the boundaries of our friendship began to blur. We stayed up late, the hours slipping by as we talked about everything and nothing. He opened up in ways he never had before, sharing stories from his childhood, dreams he'd never voiced, and fears that kept him awake at night. "I don't know who I am without her," he admitted, his voice cracking. "You're David," I said firmly. "You're kind, loyal, and stronger than you think. Emily didn't define you, you define yourself." He stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, to my surprise, he reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was firm but tentative, as though he wasn't sure if the gesture was welcome. "Thank you," he said softly. I felt a warmth spread through me, a dangerous flicker of hope I'd tried so hard to suppress. As the days turned into weeks, our bond deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. David began relying on me for more than just emotional support. We spent nearly every evening together, our conversations growing increasingly intimate. One evening, after a particularly hard day, he showed up at my apartment with a bottle of wine. "Hope you don't mind," he said, holding it up like a peace offering. "I just didn't want to be alone tonight." We sat on the floor, the bottle between us, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. As the wine loosened our tongues, the conversation turned to his fears about moving forward. I don't even know where to start, he confessed, his voice tinged with frustration. How do you rebuild after something like this? You start small, I said. One step at a time. You don't have to figure it all out right now. He nodded but didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the glass in his hand. Then, after a long pause, he said, You make it sound so easy. It's not, I admitted. But you don't have to do it alone. He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine. You really mean that, don't you? Of course I do, I said, my voice steady despite the rapid beat of my heart. He reached for my hand again, and this time, he didn't let go. The air between us shifted, the silence heavy with unspoken words. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the way his fingers tightened slightly around mine. Mike, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah. I don't know what I'd do without you. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. You don't have to know. I'm here. The words felt inadequate, but they were all I could manage. And then, before I could process what was happening, he leaned in. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No grand gestures or sudden declarations. It was soft, tentative, and achingly vulnerable. His lips brushed mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. When he pulled back, his eyes were wide with uncertainty. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. Don't, I said, cutting him off. Don't apologize. He stared at me, his breath hitching. I don't know what this means. I don't even know what I'm feeling right now. You don't have to figure it out tonight, I said, my voice gentle. We'll take it one step at a time. Together. For the first time in weeks, he smiled. A real, unguarded smile that made my heart ache with both joy and fear. The moment wasn't perfect, and neither were we. But in that small, fragile connection, I felt something I hadn't dared to hope for, the possibility of more. As the night wore on, we didn't speak of what had happened, letting the silence settle between us like a fragile truce. But as he fell asleep on my couch, his hand still loosely holding mine, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something neither of us had been ready to face. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to hope. The morning after, David was quieter than usual. He sat on the edge of my couch, nursing a cup of coffee, his gaze fixed on some indeterminate point outside the window. The weight of last night hung heavily in the room, unspoken but impossible to ignore. I joined him in silence, my own thoughts a tangled mess. The kiss we'd shared had been tentative, fleeting, yet it felt monumental, like we had crossed into uncharted territory, one that couldn't be undone. Mike, he began, his voice breaking the stillness. About last night? I braced myself, half expecting an apology, a retraction, anything that would take us back to the safe confines of friendship. But his words faltered, and he let out a shaky breath instead. I don't regret it, he said finally, his voice soft but resolute. Relief washed over me, though it was tinged with a new fear. What came next? Neither do I said, keeping my voice steady. But we don't have to figure it all out right now. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. I'm scared, I don't want to mess this up. I don't even know what this is. It doesn't have to be anything yet, I assured him. Let's just take it one day at a time. No pressure, no expectations. He nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly, but the tension between us lingered. Over the next few weeks, we settled into an unspoken rhythm. David still came over often, but things were different now. There was a softness to our interactions, a quiet intimacy that hadn't been there before. We didn't talk about the kiss, but it hovered in the background, coloring every glance, every touch, every moment of shared laughter. Yet, for all the progress we'd made, doubt began to creep in. David was healing, slowly but surely, but I couldn't shake the fear that I was just a crutch, a temporary comfort in the aftermath of his heartbreak. One evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the city lights, I decided to address the unspoken. David, I said, breaking the comfortable silence. Can I ask you something? Of course, he replied, turning to face me. Are you sure this isn't just a reaction to everything that happened with Emily? His brows furrowed, and for a moment he looked almost hurt. Is that what you think? I don't know, I admitted, my voice hesitant. I just don't want you to feel like you have to lean on me because you're still hurting. I want this to be real, for both of us. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Mike, you've been my rock through all of this, but this isn't about Emily anymore. This is about you and me. I don't know where it's going, but I know it feels right. Doesn't it feel right to you? I couldn't deny it. It did feel right, terrifying and uncertain, but right. In the weeks that followed, we began to explore what us meant. It wasn't perfect. David had moments of doubt, and so did I. We both carried scars, his from a love that betrayed him, and mine from years of unspoken feelings. But we faced them together, learning to navigate the delicate balance between friendship and something more. One day, as we walked through the park, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. You know, he said, if you hadn't been there for me, I don't think I'd have made it through this. You would have, I replied, smiling. You're stronger than you think. He stopped walking and looked at me, his eyes soft but serious. Maybe, but it wouldn't have been the same. You've always been there for me, Mike. I just wish I'd seen it sooner. His words stirred something deep within me, a mixture of gratitude, hope, and a lingering ache of everything we'd been through. I'm glad you did, I said simply. As the months passed, our relationship grew stronger. It wasn't without its challenges. Navigating the shift from friendship to something romantic was a journey filled with moments of uncertainty and vulnerability. But it was worth it. Through it all, one thing became clear: love isn't always neat or predictable. Sometimes, it's born from the ashes of something broken, fragile, and uncertain, yet deeply transformative. In the end, David and I didn't need to define what we were. We didn't need to have all the answers. What mattered was that we were there for each other, building something real, one day at a time. Moral of the story: love has a way of finding us in the most unexpected places. It isn't always perfect or easy, but it thrives in the spaces where honesty, vulnerability, and compassion meet. Sometimes, the strongest relationships come from the willingness to face the unknown together.